You're listening to an exclusive episode of the NK News podcast, available only to subscribers. You can listen to this and other episodes from your preferred podcast player by accessing the private podcast feed. For more detailed instructions, please see the step-by-step guide on the NK News website at nknews.org/private-feed. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko's Wetsuit, and this episode is being recorded via StreamYard on Saturday, the 30th of August, 2025. And I'm joined here by a returning guest, and that's Dr. Myong-hyun, and he's the director of the Department of Security Strategy Studies at the Institute for National Security Strategy, or INSS, one of the big think tanks here in Seoul. Previously, he was at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, working on hybrid threats in Northeast Asia and the international coordination to counter them. And prior to that, he was a senior fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy. And Dr. Gore is with us today to discuss last week's Lee-Trump summit and next week's trip by Kim Jong Un to Beijing for the September 3rd Victory Day parade to mark the 80th anniversary of Japan's surrender in World War II. The last time Dr. Gore was on this podcast was almost exactly 6 years ago in August 2019 on episode 92. Welcome back, Dr. Gore.
Well, thanks for having me. 6 years.
It's great to have you again. If you could pick one signal from the Donald Trump Jae-myung summit that Pyongyang will fixate on, what is it and why does it matter for the next 3 months?
Well, I think one of the signs that Kim Jong Un was looking for was probably not so much whether President Trump or President Lee was willing to sit down with him to discuss about Korean Peninsula matters. It was probably whether President Trump and President Lee had changed their positions regarding North Korea's possession of nuclear. We know that the North Koreans put
So
on the table.
denuclearization is the biggest one for him, is it?
No, it's really about denuclearization. But the flip side of that is whether North Korea will be allowed to keep its nuclear weapons. We recognize as such, right, as a nuclear power, and I think that's the signal or sign that Kim Jong Un was looking for during that, and probably to his disappointment, that didn't come out. In fact, President Lee said something very strong about North Korea's denuclearization. He was very, I would say, sticking to. In fact, he sounded almost as a conservative president. He highlighted the need for the denuclearization of North Korea above, in my view, above the need for engagement. And
That's interesting.
even, yeah.
But of course, Kim Jong Un can ignore President Lee Jae-myung and say, well, what really matters is what Donald Trump says. Did Donald Trump say anything about denuclearization?
And no, exactly. So he didn't say anything about it, but then he didn't, at the same time, he didn't say anything about the recognizing North Korea's nuclear power, right?
Right.
So I think people often say President Trump is kind of random when he says things such a stuff like North Korea's nuclearization, Ukraine, or NATO. But in my view, President Trump has been very consistent in this regard. He makes the right sound about the recognizing North Korea as a nuclear. Sorry, right sound is actually a bad term here. He
Yeah, please be
pretends
clear
as
about
if, yeah, exactly. So he pretends as if he would recognize North Korea as a nuclear power, which probably excites Kim Jong Un a lot. But
it.
he never does that. He always stays, I think, within this side of reason, or like the mainstream view of North Korea, which is that North Korea shouldn't be rewarded for having developed and illegally, even though he
Right.
recognizes North Korea as an important interlocutor for the stability of the Korean Peninsula. So,
Yeah.
and I think but he didn't change from that position at all, in my view.
Okay, so basically, Kim Jong Un did not get the sign that he wanted from the summit, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that came out. I mean, the reaction to that, I think, came out when those Koreans reacted not to President Trump but to President Lee. I think they objected to President Lee's. I think they too objected to President Lee characterizing North Korea as a poor but aggressive country. I think that's
Mm,
how we put it. And they objected to it, and then I think the language they used was pretty aggressive. And I think it's a reflection of how disappointed they are.
right. Just before the summit, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social this mysterious message. First of all, in all caps, "What is going on in South Korea?" And then, "Seems like a purge or revolution. We can't have that and do business there." Um, it didn't seem to be brought up during the meeting itself, but what did you make of that post? And what was he trying to signal to Seoul and to his own base?
Yeah, that was a little bit of a drama, I think, pre-summit, the created tension, and I think that made it the whole visit even more interesting than it should have. But I think there's no drama at the end of the day, right? I mean, the meeting went well, the visit was smooth. But I
Yeah.
think President Trump did it, I think for two reasons, I think President Lee said it himself, speech at CSIS, following his meeting with President Trump at the Oval Office. He explained that in his view, President Trump did it because President Trump is a consummate negotiator. He is a deal
Mm,
maker, and I think he knew that there's some political troubles going on in South Korea regarding the expanding investigation into the imposition of martial law
yeah.
in Seoul last year. So I think he wanted to bring that up as a way to pressure President Lee. Maybe there was some sort of a last minute negotiation going on between South Korea and the United States at the same time. And maybe Trump wanted to get an upper hand. And
Right.
perhaps that worked, given the fact that the meeting between two leaders went down really well. But I think that probably was a very pragmatic, not pragmatic, but practical, not really reflecting any the line, deep tension between the two countries. Another one is that maybe President Trump, in addition to using this posting as a negotiation tool, perhaps he also wanted to send a message to the MAGA crowd,
Mm,
this corner of the US MAGA crowd that's very much interested in what's going on in the United
yeah.
States. This corner is very important because given the posting by the influential MAGA influencers, such
Hmm.
as Laura Loomer, Steve Bannon, they all have some sort of interest in what's going on in South Korea.
Ah, yes.
Given the fact that these influential characters or personalities in the MAGA movement discussed about what's going on in Korea as being a slow takeover of the country by the pro-China, powers, forces in the country. President Trump would have to react when he the newly elected South Korean president, and and then his election was a product of what had happened last year. So, in that sense, I think there's this subtle need or pressure on President Trump to think that this is. I think perhaps that was the reason why he made that remark, showing to the MAGA crowd that he knew what was going on and about their concerns, so he was responding to it. But that, at the end of the day, didn't lead to any consequential change in his attitude towards President Lee.
You've said a couple of times already that the summit went well, and I wonder, was
Mhm.
it enough for Lee Jae-myung just to have a non-disaster in the way that Volodymyr Zelensky had in February's visit to the White House in order to call this summit a success?
That's a good question. I think it really depends on how you look at it. I think it really depends on what kind of baseline expectations we had
Hmm.
going into the summit. And I think the baseline expectation about this visit was not that high to begin with.
Okay.
There's all this apprehension about President Trump's and MAGA crowd's view of President Lee being
Mm,
pro-Chinese and all that. And there's a track record of the ruling party personalities stating something pro-China, and also criticizing the United States quite often. So there's this apprehension that
mm,
if President Lee came to Washington and President Trump would do some random antics of
yeah.
criticizing President Lee, then the whole meeting would go south. So if that was the biggest source of concern, then that didn't happen. And I think
Hmm.
this is one of the reasons why many observers believe this meeting has been a major success. But
Mm,
if you evaluate the meeting using the criteria or normal criteria of any summit of this kind, many things fell short. Obviously, there's no joint statement after the meeting.
Yeah.
It's still there's no joint statement after the meeting. It's been almost a week,
Yes.
and there's no. I mean, there are many contentious issues in the bilateral relations. We know going into the meeting that the U.S. side was pressuring South Korea to detail out what kind of investments they had in mind for in the United States, and how was the role of the U.S. government in deciding where this so-called the investment fund
Yeah.
would be, how would that be used. So that, and also there's no discussion whatsoever about
Hmm.
burden sharing. We
Right.
know President Trump wants South Korea to spend way more on defense, for perhaps up to 5% of GDP. And also the most important part, in my view, which is what kind of policy the United States expects in regards to China. What kind of
Right.
role the South Korean military would have in case of contingency in the Indo-Pacific region. So none of these issues came up or discussed in this meeting.
Hmm.
So that's been again, these issues are still alive, and I think
Yeah.
they'd like to be discussed. So yes, it really depends on what kind of criteria you use to evaluate
Hmm.
the meeting of this kind.
Okay, let's talk about USFK and alliance issues.
Mm.
Trump's remark about US potential US ownership of land where US bases in Korea are situated certainly
Yeah.
raised some eyebrows. How does that intersect with SOFA, with host nation support talks, and with Korean domestic sensitivities? Curious to hear the rest? Become an NK News subscriber today for access to the full episode. Head to nknews.org/join for more information. If you're already a subscriber to NK News, you can listen to full episodes from your preferred podcast player by accessing the private podcast feed. For more detailed instructions, please see the step-by-step guide on the NK News website at nknews.org/private-feed.